mapping resources developed by the Science Across the City project through identifying expertise to bring that specialism to Stoke-on-Trent. I know many people in the room today are actively using the plan resources. Some may not actually even know they are using them because they've become so integrated to the medium-term plans. We sought help from Liz Lawrence as a lead author on the plan resources, and so embedded and immersed in the world of expectations and outcomes linked directly to the national curriculum. This is not about perceptions, this is about rock solid understanding and us benefiting from that contribution. So I am going to welcome Liz, although this is her second time dropping into the city. The first time was a touch base, listen to, consult with, and Liz is going to reveal the contributors to this project to date. A number of science influencers from across the city and a number of secondary schools joined us in our first meeting to give us a steer and have fed back and made comments along the way. You will note there is also Jane Turner making comments. She will quality assure the final documents in order that they can go live nationally. So not only has this been developed in Stoke-on-Trent, it will be a gift from Stoke-on-Trent to all schools across the country. There is no point reinventing the wheel. I do believe these documents are going to be exceedingly useful. The detail may be overwhelming on your first viewing, and therefore we need to listen carefully as we hand over to Liz to guide us through the documents. Over to you, Liz, and you are most welcome.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Tina. I feel a bit like a rock star. Good afternoon, Stoke. Those names up there, I am really grateful to myself as well. Tina will probably have heard me say before, mostly in PSQM meetings, oh, today made my brain hurt, but in a good way. I'd say this project has been a bit the same. It's made my brain hurt, but in a good way. And I have so much enjoyed the challenge and collaboration that I've had from all the people involved. So the rationale for the project, I think we're probably all aware that we've got a problem at the moment. We need to mitigate that disruption that's been going on during lockdown. We know that some year groups will have missed a whole topic, either because it wasn't taught or because so many of the children were not able to access it. Key steps will have been missed in that progression of conceptual and skills development. You can't just take a chunk out and it's gone. It impacts not only on the progression within that specific area of content, but often into other areas. Impact at all transition points, key stages and phases. And we also know that for disadvantaged groups, because of the challenges of home learning and the challenges indeed of learning at all, the effect is likely to be greater. We're not going to solve that problem by cramming in catch-up. Everything's already crowded, and just throwing in a few random extra lessons here and there in September isn't going to deal with the problem. And Tina and Karen and various other people in Stoke recognise that. We need long-term view to create an effective solution. And a phrase I took directly from Tina, a professional culture that, oh, sorry, I can't see all of my screen, a professional culture that discourages hierarchy of expertise at all transition points and promotes effective communication and learning. We've all got something to learn from the person before us in the sequence and the person after us in the sequence. We've got a number of risks. Low-level knowledge transmission, recall teaching, we get there quickly, but it's all superficial. And the children don't build up that secure understanding, they don't have process knowledge, they don't have chance to actually apply their learning get that conceptual development. If we start too high, then we demotivate the children. They give up before they start because it's totally above their heads. But if we repeat and don't acknowledge starting points, some children will disengage. There's only so much time they can spend teaching the missed content to their peers in nice little group activities before they tune out. So to mitigate it, a plan for 20 to 2022, although I'd say for some year groups, it may be longer. I've created some 3-year catch-up documents which recognise that some topics are not repeated on a 2-year cycle, and the catch-up naturally happens when you repeat it next, for instance, light in year 3 and year 6. There's also, we don't know what next year brings. We hope we'll be able to build in systematic catch-up and everything will go back to normal, but anything's possible still. That plan needs to identify the key learning children need to progress to the next bit of learning. Needs to identify the knowledge and skills that you can pick up because it's going to happen anyway. You're teaching it again. And then the bits that there isn't a logical place to teach them again for a long time. It needs to build in assessment of starting points and lead to the development of manageable medium-term plans. So these are the resources that have been created. Some of these will be familiar to some of you, although the names may have changed. We have the information and guidance documents. There's one of those for every year group, looking at the national curriculum content knowledge requirements. It's got every statement for every content area, so you can select the ones that you need to catch up on. And it's got guidance to help the subject leader to prioritise to create a long-term plan, which will feed into the medium-term planning. So, and that also references sources of elicitation activities. It's a feed-forward document. It starts with the current teacher to identify what's been missed and gives the subject leader guidance on where we go next. An example of that is here. So this is year 5. It's now been structured as an area of content per page, but I've squished 2 areas together so I can point out some features. We've got all the national curriculum statements for those areas and their links to the end of key stage teacher assessment framework. We've got suggested places where these can be caught up. Some of those are cross-curricular. We might catch up some of the animals, including humans, in PSHE. Year 6 habitats or year 6 evolution is a place to put this particular content. We've got suggestions for initial assessment. So explorify activities, concept cartoons, little pound sign next to the ones that we have to pay for. If there's no pound sign, it is a completely free resource that you can access online. And then in the final column, in the notes, we've got some risk assessment. So if it's green, it means it's not a problem. It's going to come up again. If it's in amber, then you need to be aware of it. It will, you can build it in. There are places where it will be built on, but you still need to think about it. And then some areas, so here we've got puberty highlighted, is where you actually won't be teaching it again. So you've got to make a very definite effort. Next set of documents, working scientifically information and mapping documents. These were probably the biggest headache to get right, to build them in properly. And I have to say, an awful lot of toing and froing between me and Becky and Tina on these, and just deciding what they were going to be called. So they're a mapping document. They don't contain the same degree of guidance, although there is some guidance, as you have in the content documents, but they will enable a dialogue between a subject leader and a teacher. And this is an example of one of those, again from year 5. So it's a blank document, an almost blank document for you to fill in. The purple is one possible example of an activity, but you may not do that activity, which is why it's in italics. For every area of content, the TAPS focused assessment activities that link to it are identified because they are very useful for the formative assessment, as all the other activities are for the formative assessment of content. Somebody mentioned, not sure about Explorify. There are web links at the end of the document, the guidance document. There is the web link to Explorify, so you can go and have a look at it. For each inquiry, the basic mapping is, what type of inquiry is it? What is the focus? If you're working with TAPS, which I know a lot of Stoke schools are, you'll be familiar with the idea of focusing in for teaching or assessment on one aspect or two aspects of the inquiry. And then the notes might pick up particular skills, such as drawing a scattergraph in this growth survey activity, which it may be the children's only opportunity during the year to actually practice that. And things like using a thermometer, where if we miss a unit of work out that focuses on temperature, children may not have practiced that. So that is a discussion document, and I will take you through how to complete all these. Then we have the catch-up plan templates. Those are the templates to enable you to create those documents. I'm not going to show you an example yet because we've changed the actual document so many times that the template hasn't quite caught up, but there will be a template so that you can fill it in. There are example plans, a year 5 and 6 and a year 4 to 6. So one of them shows how year 3 content would be caught up by the time you get to year 6, and the other shows how year 4 content would be caught up during years 5 and 6. And I have an example of that here. This is how the year 4 content would be caught up. So we have the units of work for year 4. We have a note about which units have part missed or completely missed content. We have the areas that were missed. These are 2 of the statements that were missed, and the subject leader has worked with the teacher to fill in where to make decisions about where that catch-up is going to take place. So the electricity catch-up will logically happen in the year 6 unit of work. But because conductivity is mentioned as a property in year 5, the year 5 teacher just needs to remember, don't worry about that, it'll be caught up in year 6, they don't know it yet. Whereas the animals, including humans content fits better in the habitats unit for year 5. And we can see these highlighted units are the ones that are impacted by catch-up. For these children, all the other units of work can go ahead as planned. So the medium-term plans need to be changed for these 3 units, 2 of them in year 5 and 1 of them in year 6. The final document will be the introduction and how to use this resource. That is still in production. Some of the things I'm doing in this PowerPoint and the questions you asked me, I hope will feed into creating that. So how to use it? What I'm going to do for you is take you through a flowchart and then demonstrate it by going step by step through one set of planning. So the first thing that happens is that conversation between the teacher and the year, or all the teachers in the year group and the subject leader, using the information and guidance document. Key questions: which units of work were compromised? So start with the big picture. Which units were being taught during lockdown, or afterwards when only a few of the kids were in school? And then drilling down which statements were not taught, partially taught, or only covered by some pupils. Now, the year 6 document, which looks a little bit different from the others, will be annotated during that conversation, and that can then be passed directly to the secondary school to inform them. There's no further planning needed in the primary, and I'll come back to that document later. Meanwhile, in the primary, we've also got to have that conversation about working scientifically. Complete that working scientifically information and mapping document to show what inquiries were planned for last year. What was the inquiry type and the focus, and which were actually taught. There will be a temptation just to say, these are the units we missed, what were the inquiries, let's look at those. However, if you complete the whole document, then what you will find is that you can more easily identify the gaps. You can look across the whole document and say, yeah, it's a shame we haven't done this inquiry, but we've got 2 or 3 other opportunities that the children did have to practice that skill or do that inquiry type. And actually, it's more important to catch up with this inquiry because we've got limited opportunities to do pattern seeking, or the children seem to have missed an entire term when the focus was very much on concluding and evaluating, and so they haven't done much of that. So that has to be a priority. I noticed Tina's commenting about mixed language. There is a difference and an overlap between inquiry and practical work. We need that whole inquiry cycle. However, there are some key skills sometimes gained from practical skills activities. So it may be, if you haven't done the inquiry that use it, enough of the inquiries that use the thermometer, and you don't have time to repeat to do all of them as part of your catch-up, you select the ones that will best support the conceptual development and put in an extra little practical activity just targeted at the skill of using a thermometer, which will not be an inquiry, but which will be practical work. Equally, inquiry doesn't have to be practical. The document and the TAPS resources recognise research inquiries using secondary sources. There will also need to be a feed-forward conversation involving the next year group. So if that conversation was between the subject leader and the Year 2 teacher to identify what inquiries were planned and which ones have been missed, that same conversation would need to happen with the Year 3 teacher, and then ideally you would get them all together, or the subject leader pulls the information together to say, right, now looking at Year 3, I'm not worried about those concluding lessons quite as much, because I can see that we've got a lot of inquiries where the children will get a chance to draw conclusions and explain in Year 3, so I just need to alert the Year 3 teacher to start a bit further back with that, rather than pack in every single inquiry we were going to do in Year 2. So we're looking at what the gaps in coverage are for the children as they move forward, and which are the high risk gaps, the ones that will impact most on their learning as they move into the next year group, and therefore what needs to be built into the catch-up plan. All of that info is pulled together by the subject leader to complete a catch-up plan on the template. And that is then shared and discussed with the next teacher. So if this was all about what was missed in Year 2, the catch-up plan would go to the Year 3 teacher. It's a long-term plan, as we've already seen. It identifies the national curriculum statements missed and where they're going to be fitted in. That teacher, working with the subject leader if necessary, can create new medium-term plans. That is where things like the plan resources and your own schemes of work and your own progressions are really, really important, because the Year 3 teacher may want to look back and say, what exactly is it they missed? I've got this statement, but what if I've never taught that year group? What would those children have been doing? What is that inquiry I need to fit in? What can I expect? And then that catch-up plan will follow the children. It will follow those children from Year 2 into Year 3, into Year 4, if there's catch-up planned for year 4, it may need to follow them further, especially if there is disruption next year and that plan has to shift around again. So it's got to be an evolving document. Let's see how that works in practice. We're starting, I'm going to use a year 2 example. So the conversation starts with which units of work were compromised, and I've got the catch-up plan in front of me, which has got the units of work in the order they're taught in the long-term plan for my school. And I can see here that habitats wasn't completed. It was mostly taught but not completed. Because plants is spread across the spring term and the summer term, they planted the bulbs. And actually, because the teacher was in and out of school and took photos and everything else, they've pretty much done that remotely. But they were supposed to plant seeds in the summer term and that never happened. Materials was also split with that little bit about changing shape happening in the summer term, and that's just fallen off completely while we were trying to catch up plants remotely and juggle everything else. So those are the compromised areas. If we move to the information and guidance document, still in that conversation between the subject leader and the year 2 teacher, which statements were not taught, partially taught, or only covered by some pupils? So this is the key statement. Most of the habitats work was taught. Some of it was even taught in the autumn term because that unit was split. But this was going to be the end bit. We've done all the other looking in habitats. We're going to pull all that together and make sure we're secure on living dead and never been alive. And that wasn't taught. So skipping forward, this is the extract enlarged, and we can see we transfer that to the catch-up plan. So that is the missed at risk content. The notes tell us it wasn't taught, but they've done everything moving up to it. And the recommendation is put it in the year 4 habitats unit. So it's not a year 3 action, it's a year 4 action. And it's going to be an extra lesson before they classify living things. Do we actually know the difference between a living thing and something that isn't living? We've also got on the end a suggested route into that, our elicitation, the big question, how can we tell if something is alive? It may be that the subject leader decides those, picking from the menu they've got. It may be that the class teacher decides those, referring back to the information and guidance document, or using whatever else you've got in school that you typically use for elicitation. We then need to go back. Oh, sorry, my catch-up plan therefore looks like this. I've now added in my living things and their habitats as a catch-up action, and I've highlighted my habitats unit in year 4 as one where catch-up will be needed to be incorporated. Looking back, my other 2 missed units, misstatements, part of observe and describe how seeds and bulbs grow into mature plants, because we've covered bulbs, but we're not very good on seeds. And the whole of that statement about solid objects being changed. And we're making the decision here that we put it into year 3 and into year 5. Sorry, into year 3 again. At the start of the forces unit, we need, before we go on to other forces, we need that materials bit, because although it's called materials, we know when we look at our knowledge progression, it's actually about forces. It's about how we use pushes, pulls, when we're squashing, bending and twisting. So they need to have a bit of understanding of that before we jump them straight into contact forces and non-contact forces. And in here, we can see that they will be doing the plant life cycle, but we can't assume the prior learning. Some of them planted the seeds at home, but some of them grew, some of them didn't, some of them never planted a seed, some of them didn't have anywhere to plant it. So we end up with our catch-up plan now showing us that the year 3 teacher is going to build in some learning on plant life cycles around germination and maybe those beginning stages of the plant life cycle, rather than the bits involving flowers and reproduction. And we're going to build in that introductory lesson, and we've got some more suggested initial assessment activities. Now we can have that conversation about working scientifically, or maybe we've got all the documents out and we're having that conversation at the same time. So looking at living things and their habitats, and it may be that you've already got your inquiries beautifully mapped, or it may be you'll be having that conversation that said, so if you taught this unit, what were you planning to do? What sorts of things do you think the children have missed? But for this habitat unit, they planned a survey. That survey happened because most of the habitats unit was taught. Habitats across the year happened. Absolutely, teacher talk is essential. These documents are all about the conversation you have around them. You can't complete them without the conversation. You can't use them without the conversation. They are a way of getting people talking, and hey, that is the key thing for catch up, really. That communication, looking back and feeding forward. We also find the TAPS focused assessments, the woodlice one was never going to happen. That wasn't one the teacher wanted to do, but they have done the nature spotters one. However, the living and non-living was planned, and that didn't happen because that was going to be the vehicle for teaching that bit of content. So we've got something that we could take forward into the catch-up plan. So when we go back to the catch-up plan, we've now got our inquiries added in. We've put in that TAPS inquiry because it's also a really good way to teach the content. For year 3, we haven't put in a new inquiry, but we've reminded the teacher, when you're planting things, to observe the whole life cycle. Don't forget to look at germination. Don't start it at the point where they're growing and flowering. And we're talking about bees and pollen, because they won't necessarily know about germination. And then in materials, we had a whole range of things that we could have done, but actually there was a nice little investigation about Horrid Henry's catapult, finding elastic materials for the stretchy part of the catapult, and finding something that's rigid as a structure to put it together. And because that's an opportunity to plan some fair tests or comparative tests, and there's a big emphasis on that in the forces unit anyway, we've decided that is a good way to develop those working scientifically skills and to apply some of the knowledge. So we've now got a catch-up plan that we'll go through into year 3 and into year 4 with those children. And then by the time they get to year 5, they should be up to speed with everything. Unless we have a little crisis round here somewhere, which might be a COVID-caused crisis, or might be a crisis simply caused by not being able to fit in all the catch-up, in which case things might start oozing over into later, and we go back, and at the end of year 3 for those children, we have another conversation which says, did all the catch-up happen? Have there been any other gaps created that we need to be aware of, because we had a load of cases and we had to shut the school for part of the time, and actually maybe they missed skeletons out. I think I'm going to pause there before I go on to key stage 2 and 2 to 3, because I've already thrown a lot at you, and I just want you to ponder and think about if you've got any questions or comments so far. So just think about what I've shown you. Think about how you would use the document. I think my main concern, Leanne, is that it makes sense when I go through it like this, and hopefully the flow chart will work. But having done this, I will need a steer, and that may come in this meeting, or it may come from people contacting Tina or me afterwards, just to make sure that what goes in that how to use this document is clear enough and not so many pages that people won't get to the end of it. I'll give you another minute or so, because I think some of you are probably chatting to each other rather than to the whole group, which is great. I've taken you through what I see as the process for going through it. However, it may work a little bit differently in your school. You may actually have all the working scientifically conversations first, so that you've got all of that in front of you before you even go into the conversations about the individual units of work. Or it may be that everything is beautifully mapped in your school, and either you can pull off the system or you can just send that working scientifically document to all your year groups, and it will ping back to you fully completed because everyone's confident with it. Whereas in other schools, the conversations might be around, are we supposed to have a skills focus? We don't really have one of those. Or, oh, I hadn't thought of using the task activities, let's have a look at them. I am going to move on now to key stage 2 into 3. This is seen as particularly problematic because the conversations are happening in between people in different locations, although we know that conversations between infant and junior schools can be just as difficult and just as fraught. Many years ago, I worked in a junior school where the head was not on speaking terms with the head of the infants, and therefore we were not only not encouraged to communicate, we were actively encouraged to do things in a different way just to thwart the infant school, which really wasn't productive. There've always been gaps. Secondary teachers are used to dealing with gaps. Different pupils. Not every pupil will meet the standard for the end of the key stage. Those end of key stage framework statements are great, but not every child will tick all of those boxes. Different feeder schools, both in the experiences they've had, and sadly, because we don't have enough moderation conversations between primary schools for science, in what expectations of the standards look like, which is partly why the plan resources were set up. Primary teachers' expectations of the end of Key Stage 2 and secondary teachers' expectations of the starting points for Key Stage 3. They may be miles apart. There may be a massive overlap, with starting points for Key Stage 3 assumed to be a lot lower than the end points for Key Stage 2. Different schools, different circumstances. And there is the gap that involves the children themselves. Over 6 weeks, they magically forget everything they ever knew in primary school. Some of these children will not have been in school or will have barely been in school for 6 months. How much more will they have forgotten? I told a little anecdote, I'll get anecdotal, in a session I was doing this morning about a transition teach meet, where the secondary school setting it up had invited various primaries and secondaries, and they'd actually got some children to talk. It was great. But they had a year 7 boy talking about what he wished he'd known to support him with transition into secondary school science. And he talked about how he wished they'd done lots of chemistry in primary school, because he was really enjoying chemistry, but he didn't feel he knew any chemistry. And how all his teachers kept telling him how important fair tests were, and he didn't think he knew enough about fair tests. And there was one teacher sitting wriggling and twitching through the entirety, and in the end she looked him straight in the eye and said, "You were in my school last year, weren't you? We did this, 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 this. Were they fair tests? Did you use a fair test planning board?" "Oh yeah, it just looked a bit different from the one we're using in secondary school. We did this, 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 and this. Were they all chemistry activities? We called it materials, but was it chemistry?" Yeah, it was, wasn't it? So it hadn't taken him long to forget what he knew and the connection had not been made. We have solutions. If we know the progression, curriculum and conceptual understanding, we can get over that primary secondary barrier. If we use good formative assessment at all transition points to identify starting points and misconceptions, we can clue in to what we know from the progression the children should know and be able to do, ideally in a context that makes sense to them, and activate that prior learning or identify where it genuinely doesn't exist or where there are misconceptions. And we need good communication between teachers, which enable both of those other things to happen. So the Year 6 document starts off very similarly. We've got the statement, so here we're looking at light, and then we've got the end of key stage teacher assessment framework statement with the bits that particularly relate to Year 6 highlighted. We can see some of it's taught in Year 3, which is interesting because if they've missed out on Year 6 learning, there'll be some stuff they still know if they can remember that far back, and they might have applied it in Year 5 when they were looking at shadows in relation to the apparent movement of the sun. We've now got Key Stage 3 curriculum links, and in here I've put, which is new from the last time people saw this document, your very own assessment for learning opportunities, because why should the primaries get all the support? So this links it to the best diagnostic assessments, which I'll come back to in a minute. The idea with this document is not that the primary is particularly involved in creating a catch-up plan, although it would be great if that conversation could happen, but that this document is annotated with the Year 6 teacher to identify what was taught, not taught, missed out, and then forms the basis of at least a dialogue with the secondary about what's been missed, even if it doesn't extend to how it might be and where it might be caught up. At the very least, a transfer of this document. I'm well aware that some secondary colleagues will say, but if we get one of these from every feeder primary school, what are we going to do with all that information? If all the feeder primaries come back and tell you that different things have been missed, you know that you're going to have to do some really serious thinking a long way through Key Stage 3 about a lot of areas of content. In reality, a lot of schools will probably follow similar teaching sequences, and you may find a lot of your schools have missed out on what on the same units of work. So you might find that everybody has actually done light earlier in the year, and you don't have to worry about that any more than you normally would, because there will be some children who didn't get it the first time. But there are other areas of content where the vast majority of your children haven't got it. Secondary teachers may or may not be familiar with BEST. Primary teachers probably aren't, so I'm just going to do a brief seg off into BEST. Apologies for those of you like Joe who are familiar with the resource, but it's from the University of York. It's another free resource. I think it's very, very useful for secondaries. It's also quite useful for primary schools because it shows where the children are going. It shows what the expected prior learning is from a secondary point of view, and it shows the key misconceptions. And when we dig down into those, a lot of those are reflected in the plan resources. I did a session for ASC this morning where we compared the work of children from the plan resource in Year 6 and from earlier in the school to see that progression with what the best resources expect. So we've got the areas in biology, physics, and in the middle there, chemistry. And those are broken down into key concepts. So this key concept has a progression. It's about light travelling in straight lines at high speeds. Well, we know that that is something we expect children to know in primary. And the first two activities on there, the first two aspects of the progression are marked with P for prior learning. So children should identify a shadow made by an object and describe how light travels in straight lines. Linking those two, then they explain how shadows are formed, and then we move on to look at other aspects of light travelling. We have diagnostic questions. This is a resource full of free diagnostic questions, short activities that enable you to spot the misunderstandings, and response activities, which are activities the teacher can then use to support the development of that understanding. This one, a penguin shadow, is the first one on that list. So we have a very simple setup which will be familiar to, certainly to Year 6 teachers, probably to Year 3 teachers. And we have a question. So what we're looking for there is the confusions. Do they show it the same size as the toy, not recognizing that we have those distances which will make the shadow bigger? Do they show features of the shadow? Do they confuse it with a reflection and reverse it rather than confusing it with a reflection by showing features? Or do they select the larger, non-featured and correctly orientated version? Now, that will clue you into misconceptions. I would hope that a lot of Year 3 children would get this right. I would hope the majority of Year 6 children would get this right. If we move on to look at that end of key stage statement, we can see, use the idea that light from light sources or reflected light travels in straight line to explain how we see objects is Year 6. But if we track back, the formation, shape and size of shadows. And if we go into the plan resources, we find Muharrem is doing precisely that. He is drawing light rays to show that the light travels in straight lines. So not only do we create a shadow, but also the shadow changes, the shadow is the same shape as the object and changes in size as we change the relative positions. And we can see that this activity we've just looked at links to using the idea light travels in straight lines to explain why shadows have the same shape as the objects that cast them. So that is the Year 6 class of September 2020. What about the Year 7 class of September 2020? What about the Year 7 class of September 2021? We are not just in a one-year catch-up situation. All of these content areas are taught in Year 5. The Year 5s who are about to move into Year 6, the primaries will be completing a catch-up plan in relation to areas of this content, feeding it into Year 6, which already has quite a lot in it, along with all the catch-up they're going to do for maths and English to get them through the SATs and every other curriculum area. So, several things might happen. They might miraculously manage to fit all that content in and teach it in Year 6. But it may still be a bit shaky because that's a lot of science to get through if there are one or maybe two areas of this that will compromise. They might manage to catch up some of it, but the children will go up with a gap. Maybe Earth and Space just never gets revisited because it doesn't, or maybe Earth and Space is revisited because it links to light, but forces isn't because there's no obvious link here and they just can't fit it in. Or it may be that there is a priority on catching up the earlier content to make sure that we're not carrying deficits forward and something drops off here. So next year, there may need to be a conversation not just around those Year 6 content areas, but those Year 5 content areas as well, when we have children moving up into secondary school. There is potential for a greater variety of gaps. After that, if the catch-up plan for missed content in year 4 has worked, we should be back on track. But there are no guarantees in this world. Thoughts and questions. That is me pretty much done. Tina's got a couple of things to say at the end, but I'm really interested in you thinking through, maybe talking to each other first and then coming back and talking to me, because I need to know what your questions are to make sure that any guidance that goes out with this or any last minute tweaks to the document make this resource as good as it can be for you, because it's not me that's going to be using it.
Thank you, Liz. I will do formal thanks in a minute, but I am going to encourage the thoughts and the questions. Having done a couple of these types of sessions in a similar format to yourself, the hardest thing is to sit still while people think. So I am actually going to switch on the clock, and I am going to give the room 60 seconds of silence to be able to watch some of the questions coming through, or to encourage people to be starting to question each other within subgroups. So I think we have at least 3 senior leaders in the room who are not necessarily science leaders, but are here about curriculum plan. Maybe they can message each other questions about what they're doing and how this might work. But the hard bit is stopping talking. So I'm going to do that and watch the clock. I've given the 60 seconds. We don't have many specific questions at this stage. We will leave the room open so people can continue to add questions 5 minutes beyond the end of the meeting. And I'm also loving the comment from Jen that she's got to rescue her TV from my screen. We set out to be about an hour. So the question format is really important that people add their questions there, but we're unlikely to have time to answer those in this meeting. Please keep adding your notes, but Liz, I'm going to ask you to move on to the next slide.
Can I just myself before that say, is there a possibility of anything useful from that chat both being sent to me so I know the questions, but also I've seen, for instance, a resource recommendation in there, so being sent to the participants?
Absolutely. The chat and the slides will be shared with everybody who's joined the room, and the recording of the meeting will be located ideally on the Science Across the City website. The first draft of these materials is already lodged on our website, so people can find them quickly and easily. I certainly found attachments to emails were becoming very confusing, so having a single go-to point was important. And that single go-to point will be continually updated with all the year groups being lodged in there by early July.
Yeah, just watch out. There are a couple of dodgy typos and mistakes, but I will try and get updated versions to Tina as soon as possible. Right.
They show you're human. So I'm going to start to round off and summarise. We had a meeting on the 25th of March, and at that meeting, those in the room agreed these were the things they wanted. I am so pleased when I looked back at these notes that we've made such progress on meeting the expectations of the city. We are here as a project to engage with expertise, and thank you, Liz. Awesome. You can tell that you have lived this, breathed it, and the ownership is awesome, but we're delighted to be able to tap into that. We have enabled that expertise to come to the city, but we are empowering groups in the city to utilise these resources. And this is not the end point. We intend to have lots of small groups talking this through in terms of what it means for your school, what it means for your group of schools, and what it might mean for your feeder schools. We can support those conversations and help you to mediate them, because we do have science influencers that are keen to unpick and help with this activity. The challenge is the uniqueness. It's the uniqueness for your school, for your children, and for the next few years. But actually, I'm going to finish this on a really positive note. Whilst no one wants the situation we are in, the most exciting opportunity arising from this is the chance for meaningful teacher talk. Knowing about diagnostic questions, responsive teaching, knowing that what you might have been teaching next week is actually a year 3 lesson is going to make every minute count for those children for the next 2 years. So thank you ever so much, Liz. This is definitely not an end point. We are going to make you very welcome and one of our team. Thank you. So our thanks do go to Liz for her direction, to the influencers for their responsiveness, and David has left the room, although Liz did notice that David was in the room. David is monitoring our spend, so for the OA for making the funding to make this happen. It is an example of the team engaging, enabling and empowering, even within the context of lockdown. So please, we all know this is a problem. We all now know that we're working on it together. And on that note, I thank you all very much for your time and wish you well.